My brother framed me for theft when I covered his bills for years, so I gathered proof, pressed charges and took back everything quietly legally. I'm a 27-year-old guy, and for as long as I can remember, my role in my family was simple: fix problems quietly and don't expect anything in return. I wasn't told this outright, it was just understood. If something went wrong, eyes slowly drifted toward me, like gravity. I learned early that being dependable meant staying calm, swallowing frustration, and never making things about myself. Growing up as the older brother came with invisible rules. I was expected to be mature even when I was still a kid, forgiving even when I was hurt, and responsible long before I actually understood money. When I messed up, it was a lesson. When my younger brother messed up, it was a phase. My parents used to say things like, "You're strong enough to handle it," which sounded like praise until I realized it really meant, "We're not going to help you." My brother, on the other hand, had this effortless charm. People liked him instantly. He was impulsive, emotional, always chasing something new, always just one step away from getting his life together. My parents worried about him constantly, defended him reflexively, and excused things they would never have tolerated from me. "He's just struggling," they'd say, every single time. I started working early, part-time jobs, overtime shifts, anything steady. I liked the feeling of control, of knowing I could cover my own expenses. Over time, that turned into covering everyone's expenses. First it was small things. Then it was rent. Then credit cards. Then emergencies that somehow kept happening. My phone would buzz late at night, and I already knew what the message would say. "Can you help him out this month? Just until he gets back on his feet." At some point, it stopped feeling like help and started feeling like obligation. But I told myself this was what family did. I genuinely believed that if I kept showing up, quietly, consistently, loyalty would come back to me eventually. I didn't realize then that I was training everyone to see me as disposable. At first, helping my brother felt temporary, like spotting someone gas money when they're down. But somewhere along the line, the tone changed. It stopped being, "Can you help?" and turned into, "We need you to handle this." No thank you. No conversation. Just expectation. The requests started stacking up. Rent 1 month. Utilities the next. Then his car payment because he needed it for work. I remember sitting at my kitchen table late one night, laptop open, calculator app glowing, trying to convince myself the numbers still made sense. My brother would promise, "Just 1 more month, man. I swear." And I wanted to believe him, because believing him meant this was still under control. My parents reinforced it without realizing, or maybe without caring. My mom would sigh heavily on the phone and say things like, "You know how stressed your father gets about him." My dad would add, "You're the responsible one. He listens to you." Responsibility, in their language, meant absorbing the fallout so no one else had to. The worst part was how normal it became. Covering his bills stopped feeling like generosity and started feeling like my assigned role. When I hesitated once, just once, my mom's voice hardened. "What's gotten into you?" she asked. "This isn't like you." As if setting a boundary was a personality flaw. I started lying about my own finances. I said I was fine even when I wasn't. I skipped things I wanted, delayed plans, ignored the quiet resentment building in my chest. Every transfer I sent felt heavier than the last, but I told myself it was better than conflict. Better than being labeled selfish. Family gatherings felt different too. No one asked how I was doing, but everyone assumed I'd handle whatever crisis came next. My brother would clap me on the shoulder and joke, "Don't worry, I've got you next time." We both knew that wasn't true. I didn't realize it then, but something dangerous was happening. Helping had turned into obligation, and obligation was quietly turning me into the villain the moment I stopped complying. The more I helped, the more invisible I became. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you only notice when you replay conversations in your head later. My brother would mention some half-finished plan, another job he was thinking about, another idea he was almost ready to commit to, and my parents would light up like he'd already succeeded. "See? He's trying," they'd say, proud. When I talked about my own work, the long hours, the pressure, the constant balancing act, the response was always smaller. A nod. A quick, "That's good." No excitement. No recognition. I wasn't doing anything impressive in their eyes, I was just doing what was expected. At family dinners, my brother's struggles were discussed openly, sympathetically. His mistakes were framed as obstacles bravely endured. Mine were never discussed at all. The financial help I gave was treated like background noise, something that didn't deserve mention because it kept things running smoothly. I remember sitting at the table, listening to my dad say, "We just worry so much about him," while I quietly paid the restaurant bill at the end of the night. Anytime I tried to explain how overwhelmed I felt, the conversation shifted. "Don't compare yourself to him," my mom would say. "You're different." Different, apparently, meant I didn't need support. It meant I was the one who could handle disappointment, pressure, and silence without complaint. The narrative formed without anyone ever stating it outright. My brother was the golden child fighting uphill battles. I was the stable background character whose sacrifices didn't count because they didn't create drama. If I succeeded, it was expected. If he failed, it was tragic. I started questioning myself. Maybe I was cold for feeling resentful. Maybe I was supposed to give without keeping score. But deep down, something felt wrong. Love wasn't supposed to feel like erasure. I didn't know it yet, but this story they were telling, about him, about me, was setting me up. And when it finally cracked, it wasn't going to break in my favor. The call came on a Tuesday morning, right in the middle of work. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something in my chest tightened the second I answered. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and completely surreal. They said my name, confirmed my address, and then asked if I was aware of missing funds connected to a family-owned business account. I remember laughing at first. A short, confused sound. I told them there had to be a mistake. I didn't even have regular access to that account. The silence that followed was heavy, like they were letting my denial sit in the air. Then they said my brother had already given a statement. He'd accused me of taking the money over several months. My hands started shaking. I left my desk, stepped into a stairwell, and called my parents immediately. My mom answered, already emotional. Before I could explain anything, she said, "Why would you do this?" That was it. No question. No curiosity. Just certainty. My dad took the phone and said, "If you took it, the right thing is to return it before this gets worse." I felt like the ground dropped out from under me. I kept saying, "I didn't do this. I swear." My brother finally texted me, "I didn't want it to go this far, but you left me no choice." No explanation. No apology. Just accusation wrapped in victimhood. By that evening, the story had already spread. An aunt messaged me saying she was disappointed. A cousin warned me to do the right thing. Everyone seemed to know I was guilty except me. I replayed every transfer I'd ever sent, every bill I'd paid, wondering how any of this made sense. My parents asked me to come over and talk it out. When I arrived, the house felt colder, quieter. My brother wouldn't look at me. My mom cried. My dad said, "This doesn't have to ruin the family if you cooperate." That's when it hit me. They weren't trying to find the truth. They were trying to contain me. After that night, everything changed at once and somehow also dragged on forever. My parents stopped calling unless it was to check in, which really meant reminding me how serious the situation was and how much stress I was causing. My brother suddenly became unreachable, except through carefully worded messages that made him sound fragile and afraid. Meanwhile, I was wide awake every night, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations and trying to understand how reality had flipped so completely. Word traveled fast. Faster than I expected. Family group chats went quiet when I sent messages. Invitations disappeared. When I ran into relatives by accident, their smiles were tight, their eyes cautious, like I was something unstable that might explode if handled wrong. One aunt pulled me aside at the grocery store and whispered, "Your parents are devastated. You should think about making this right." She didn't ask if I'd done it. She didn't need to. My parents framed everything as concern, but it felt like pressure. "Just admit it so we can move on," my mom said during one call, her voice exhausted. "You've always been good at fixing things." My dad added, "Even if you didn't mean to, dragging this out will ruin your brother's future." Somehow, the conversation always ended with me being the problem, the obstacle standing in the way of peace. The worst part was the doubt. When enough people look at you like you're guilty, something starts to rot inside your head. I went through bank statements obsessively, even though I knew I hadn't taken anything. I started second-guessing my own memory, my own sanity. Maybe I'd missed something. Maybe I'd been careless. That tiny crack of self-doubt scared me more than the accusation itself. I felt completely alone. No family. No ally. Just a growing sense that I was being pushed into a corner where the only acceptable outcome was my silence and compliance. And for the first time in my life, I realized something terrifying: if I didn't protect myself, no one else was going to do it for me. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started as a quiet itch in the back of my mind, the kind you can't ignore once you notice it. One night, unable to sleep, I pulled up the transaction timeline the police had referenced. I wasn't trying to prove anything yet, I just needed to understand what I was being accused of. But the more I looked, the less it made sense. The dates didn't line up with my schedule. Several withdrawals happened when I was out of town for work, something I could prove easily. Others occurred on days when I hadn't even logged into my banking apps. I remember sitting on my couch, laptop balanced on my knees, the room lit only by the blue glow of the screen, my heart pounding slower, not faster, as clarity started to replace panic. Then I noticed something small but impossible to ignore. The access logs. The account showed activity from a device I didn't recognize, at times when I was asleep or at work. My stomach dropped, not from fear this time, but from realization. I hadn't taken the money. I hadn't even had the ability to take it. I started digging deeper. Old emails. Text threads. Screenshots I'd never thought to save suddenly mattered. I found messages where my brother mentioned being short again to friends, dates lining up perfectly with the missing funds. I found proof that he'd asked my parents for temporary access to the account months earlier, access they swore he didn't have. For the first time since the accusation, I stopped trying to explain myself to anyone. I didn't call my parents. I didn't confront my brother. I didn't even feel angry yet. What I felt was something colder and more focused. They didn't just believe I was guilty. They needed me to be. Because if I wasn't, everything they'd said, and done, collapsed. That night, I made a decision. I stopped defending myself emotionally. I stopped trying to be understood. If the truth was going to surface, it wasn't going to come from another conversation. It was going to come from evidence. And once I saw the full picture forming, I knew there was no going back to the way things were. Once I stopped talking, everything got quieter, and sharper. I moved through my days on autopilot, answering work emails, nodding at coworkers, pretending my life wasn't slowly splitting in two. At night, though, I became someone else entirely. That's when I opened folders, spreadsheets, message threads. That's when I hunted for the truth I already knew was there. I went back years. Every transfer I'd ever made to my brother. Every emergency text. Every late-night call that ended with me opening my banking app and swallowing the knot in my throat. I cross-checked dates against statements, compared amounts, traced patterns. It was exhausting, but it was also grounding. For the first time since this started, I felt in control. The patterns were undeniable. Missing money coincided with the exact weeks my brother had messaged friends about being desperate. Withdrawals matched times he'd claimed to be job hunting but was actually out of town. I found an old email from my mom casually mentioning that she'd given him temporary access, because he needed to sort something out. Temporary, apparently, meant unlimited. What scared me most wasn't the proof itself, it was how careful he'd been. Small amounts. Spread out. Just enough to look like sloppy bookkeeping. And just bold enough to assume no one would ever question it, especially if I was standing there as the perfect fall guy. I resisted every urge to confront him. I wanted to scream, to throw the evidence in his face, to force my parents to look at what they'd done. But I didn't. I remembered how quickly they'd chosen him over me. How easily they'd asked me to confess to something I hadn't done. So I stayed quiet. I backed everything up. Screenshots. Logs. Messages. I saved copies in places no one could touch. Each file felt like a brick, heavy and solid, stacking towards something inevitable. My anger sharpened into patience. My fear turned into resolve. They thought I was broken. Isolated. Desperate enough to fold. They had no idea I was building a case. And once it was complete, it wasn't going to be a family conversation anymore. The silence didn't protect me the way I thought it would. Instead, it became proof, at least in their minds, that I had something to hide. My parents stopped pretending to be neutral. My mom told me it would be best if I didn't come by the house anymore, not until things were resolved. My dad said nothing at all, which somehow hurt more. Family events happened without me. Birthdays. Dinners. Holidays I'd never missed. I found out through photos posted online, everyone smiling, arms around my brother, captions about sticking together during hard times. I stared at those pictures longer than I should have, my chest tight, wondering how easy it was for them to erase me once I stopped being useful. Money became another weapon. My parents asked me to stop accessing shared accounts, just to be safe. They suggested I reimburse the business preemptively as a sign of good faith. When I refused, my mom cried and said, "I don't recognize you anymore." I almost laughed. I didn't recognize them. The loneliness was crushing. I'd always thought if things ever truly fell apart, family would still be there, even if they were angry. Instead, I felt like I'd been quietly exiled. I stopped sleeping. I lost weight without trying. Some nights, I sat in my car after work, engine off, just staring at nothing because going home felt pointless. There were moments I almost gave in. Almost told them I'd repay the money just to make it stop. Almost accepted the role they'd assigned me, because being the villain still meant belonging. That scared me more than anything, how close I came to sacrificing myself just to be included again. One night, after another ignored message to my dad, I finally broke. I sat on the floor of my apartment, back against the wall, proof spread out around me like debris. I realized this was rock bottom. No support. No trust. No family left to lose. And in that emptiness, something hardened inside me. If I was going to stand alone anyway, then I was done protecting everyone else at my own expense. Once I accepted that my family was gone, at least the version of it I'd believed in, everything became disturbingly clear. I wasn't just dealing with hurt feelings or betrayal anymore. This was serious. My name was tied to an active theft accusation, and silence wasn't noble. It was dangerous. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer without telling anyone. Sitting in that office felt unreal, like I'd crossed into someone else's life. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper, and I remember gripping the arms of the chair while explaining everything from the beginning. The favoritism. The money. The accusation. When I finally slid my folder of evidence across the desk, the lawyer didn't look surprised. That scared me. They went through it carefully. Dates. Access logs. Messages. Each page shifted the tone in the room. When they looked up, they said something that made my stomach drop. You understand that if this continues, you could be charged. Hearing it out loud made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. My family hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. They'd put me in real legal danger. Then came the part one hadn't fully considered. The lawyer explained what my brother had actually done: unauthorized access, fraudulent transfers, false statements. Not a misunderstanding. Not a family dispute. Crimes. Multiple ones. My chest tightened as they explained potential consequences, and for a moment, I felt sick thinking about my parents' faces when they realized the truth. I asked the question I'd been avoiding. What happens if I don't do anything? The answer was simple and brutal: the narrative stays the same. I stay the suspect. My brother walks away clean. That was the moment the choice stopped being about loyalty. It became about survival. Protecting myself meant holding him accountable, even if it destroyed whatever was left of my family. I walked out of that office knowing one thing for certain. There was no version of this where I stayed quiet and came out okay. And once the legal process started, the truth wasn't going to ask permission before tearing everything apart. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't announce anything. I didn't even let myself feel dramatic about it. I followed my lawyer's instructions exactly, like muscle memory. Evidence was submitted formally. Statements were corrected. Timelines were reconstructed by people who didn't care about family politics or emotional narratives. They cared about facts. And the facts were ruthless. Investigators started where the paper trail led them, not where my parents wanted it to go. Access logs. IP addresses. Device fingerprints. The same unfamiliar device showed up again and again, quietly draining money while I was miles away. My name faded from relevance with every verified record. I stayed completely silent while everything moved without me. That was the strangest part, how little I had to say once the process began. For years, I'd carried conversations, explanations, justifications. Now, professionals did the talking for me. I watched from the sidelines as the story rewrote itself. My brother was contacted first. I found out later that he panicked immediately. He called my parents, frantic, claiming it was a misunderstanding, that things were being blown out of proportion. My parents tried reaching me after that, missed calls, vague texts asking if we could talk. I didn't respond. The truth didn't need my voice anymore. Then came the interviews. My brother contradicted himself. Dates shifted. Stories changed. The confidence he'd had when accusing me evaporated under scrutiny. Meanwhile, everything I'd submitted stayed consistent. Cold. Verifiable. My parents were questioned too. That was something I hadn't fully prepared for. They were forced to explain why they'd believed my brother without evidence, why they'd pressured me to confess, why they'd minimized the access they'd given him. There was no emotional framing that could save them from their own words. Still, I said nothing. No gloating. No explanations. No, I told you so. Because I knew something they didn't yet. Once the system finished its work, there would be no way to quietly undo what they'd set in motion. And when the final conclusions landed, silence was going to hit them harder than any argument ever could. The call came a few weeks later, and this time I didn't feel panic when I saw the number. I already knew what it meant. My lawyer's voice was calm, almost neutral, as they explained that charges were being formally filed against my brother. Fraud. Unauthorized access. False statements. The words landed slowly, like they needed time to exist in the same space as everything I'd lost. My name was officially cleared. Not quietly. Not vaguely. Cleared in writing. I sat there after the call ended, phone still pressed to my ear, waiting for some rush of triumph that never came. What I felt instead was a strange, hollow relief, like setting down something heavy I'd been carrying for years without realizing how bent my back had become. Then my parents showed up at my door. I hadn't invited them. I hadn't answered their calls. But there they were, standing too close, eyes red, voices unsteady. My mom started crying immediately. "We didn't know," she kept saying, over and over, like repetition could change the past. My dad wouldn't meet my eyes. He just said, "We made mistakes." Mistakes. As if this had been a misunderstanding instead of a choice. They told me my brother was spiraling. That he felt betrayed. That the family was falling apart. I listened, quietly, noticing how none of their sentences ended with an apology that actually named what they'd done to me. They wanted forgiveness without accountability. Closure without consequences. Financial restitution came next. Money returned. Accounts corrected. The things I'd paid for over the years slowly, almost insultingly, came back to me in numbers on a screen. It felt transactional in the worst way, like they thought balance sheets could repair trust. Before they left, my mom reached for my arm and said, "We're still family." I didn't pull away. I didn't argue. I just looked at her and realized something painful and final. They wanted me back now that the truth was undeniable. But I hadn't decided yet what they deserved. And walking away at that moment felt harder, and more powerful, than staying ever had. I didn't make a speech. I didn't send a long message explaining my pain or listing everything they'd done wrong. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to convince anyone of anything. The truth was already documented, stamped, and filed. Anything I said after that would only be emotional decoration. I told my parents I needed space. Not a break. Not time to cool off. Space. The kind that doesn't come with a return date. My mom cried again, softer this time, like she finally understood that this wasn't a phase I'd grow out of. My dad nodded, stiff and silent, the same way he always did when consequences finally reached him. I cut financial ties completely. Closed shared accounts. Changed passwords. Updated beneficiaries. Every small administrative step felt strangely freeing, like reclaiming pieces of myself I'd loaned out for years and never gotten back. There was no dramatic moment, just a quiet sense of control settling in. People asked if I felt guilty about my brother. I thought about that a lot. I thought about the nights I'd stayed up worrying about his rent, the money I'd sent without question, the way he'd looked me in the eye while accusing me. In the end, guilt didn't fit. Accountability did. I started sleeping again. Not perfectly, but honestly. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes, stopped bracing for emergencies that weren't mine anymore. My life got smaller in some ways, fewer people, fewer obligations, but it also got lighter. The strangest part was realizing I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad all the time. I was calm. Calm in a way I'd never been before, because my worth was no longer tied to how much I could endure for other people. I didn't take revenge loudly. I didn't destroy anyone publicly. I let the truth do what it does best when it's finally given room to breathe. I walked away with my name clear, my finances intact, and my silence unbroken. And for the first time, being the reliable one meant choosing myself.